Hi, welcome to Module 3 for Organization Design and Change Management 331. And in this module, we'll be introducing the concept of the machine metaphor, but more importantly, the evolution of structural design thinking that shapes not just the machine metaphor, but the other two metaphors that are key and central to organization design, including organism and the brain. So in this module, you're being introduced to the main framework that's formed the basis for most of our modern day understandings about design and the importance of design to how an organization functions and concepts around efficiency, control, productivity, etc. From this vantage point, like I said, there are three different metaphors over the next several weeks that stem from the ideologies that we're being introduced to in this module. So, we start with the metaphor of machines, not just understanding the imagery, but understanding the core assumptions behind this particular metaphor. Because this metaphor implicitly assumes that human beings should behave as parts of a well-oiled machine. So better organizations would be characterized much more like a machine, and that we'd be free from all of the characteristics that make humans human. Because those characteristics, being beautiful social beings, also detract from efficiency and productivity. So, organization design elements. There are a limitless number of possibilities for an organization and how an organization can be designed. And in current observations, we see all different types of new structures and new possibilities. But the prevailing ideas or notions for how we think about organizations, organizational charts, all organizations must have some sort of organizational chart. All of that stems from our understanding about certain key organizational design elements. So while we will be looking at several possibilities over time as to what organizations can be shaped as, there's certain things that must be considered to understand forms and to understand processes or change. A structural perspective pretty much emphasizes two fundamental questions that have to be answered and worked out in design. One, how will we allocate responsibilities across different roles or departments, also known as differentiation? And two, how do we integrate these diverse efforts to pursue a common goal? So there's the differentiation that must happen to allocate different roles and responsibilities, breaking things down into the components of what you need to accomplish as an organization. But at the same time, the ultimate goal for any organization is to pursue some sort of objective or goal or purpose. So the different elements that you may have within any organization must also be able to be integrated or coordinated in some way to get the ultimate goals of the organization accomplished. Getting organized then has to do with finding the right structure. That's the central concern of any organization. And even when you start to consider organizational change efforts, it's usually an effort to find the right structure or the right processes, etc., that need to be reconfigured or recombined or introduced into an organization in order to help it to meet its particular goals or purposes. But structure is more than just line and boxes on an organizational chart. It's a rational array of roles and responsibilities that depict desired patterns of activities, expectations, and exchanges among employees. So structure is much more than just how you want to design the makeup of the organization, but how you design the makeup of the organization will lead to certain patterns of activity, certain expectations, certain things that will dictate how you are able to relate to your customers, as well as how you're able to relate to those that you need to work with in order to get your organizational objectives accomplished. Structure, in this sense, is a system intended to obtain the organization's goals. So the main components or the needs that any organizational structure needs to consider is the need for a certain level of standardization, efficiency, clarity, and predictability. Again, these are four fundamental components when you're thinking about organizations as structure, when you're thinking about the machine metaphor. It's about standardization, efficiency, clarity, and predictability. Now, in modern day, structure is no longer just synonymous with bureaucracy and rigidity automatically. It used to be. However, even though we have much more flexible designs out there, more fluid structures, different sort of modern takes on flexible work arrangements, etc., at the very core of any organization, when you have to consider how are things going to get done, who's going to do what, then structure ends up being a lot of the concepts that we talk about that stem from bureaucracy still persist. So let's think about the birth of structural or machine thinking and where it came from. And basically in the industrial age, as things moved away from farming and home factories, we moved away from the village life. If you think Little House on the Prairie imagery, if you are familiar with that 80s reference, the cottage industries, craftsmanship, as we moved away from the pre-industrial age society to cities and urban areas and factories and offices, then all of the attention and mindset for how to get work done moved towards maximizing efficiency and maximizing control so that things can be more productive, so that organizations can be more productive. So in the illustration here, the transformation process of getting your inputs, your materials, your labor, your resources transformed into goods and services and profits. Ultimately, what was needed with this particular focus was that you needed someone to oversee this process and make sure that the overseeing and the structure of the operations were being done as efficiently as possible. So we enter into the age of assembly lines. And when you watch the clip that's been referred to and you have links to within the module, and it's also talked about in the overview, you get an understanding of sort of the central and the beginning ideas of Frederick Taylor and Taylorism and scientific management. And from these ideas, there's a couple of key components to consider or to keep in mind. The assembly line framework is basically an idea of turning workers into robots. And by that we mean that you want to take out again as much of the human element as possible and have people working in very specialized ways to get your work accomplished in a more productive manner. So this perspective proliferated from the numerous factories and assembly lines that began to dominate much of the industrial society in the earlier parts of the 20th century. And most prominently, you had the automobile industries, and most notably Ford. Henry Ford became popular and then famous for his particular structure for producing automobiles, which led to the mass production of automobiles and ultimately led to the mass consumption. The more that were available to buy, the more consumers were out there ready to buy. So a lot of the growth that happened in the earlier part of the 20th century were made possible because of the ideas of the assembly line. And again, the assembly line mindset is motivated by an organization needing to save time, energy, and money and become more efficient. So having said that, the most ideal way to work incorporates certain principles in the workplace, such as workers don't need to take any unnecessary steps. Work-related movements need to be reduced to an absolute minimum. Parts needed in an assembly process need to travel the least possible distance so that there's immediate availability, along with these minute steps and movements, and that mechanical means rather than human means are used to move the car in this particular example, or to move the parts from one step to another in the assembly process. And the complex sets of movements are eliminated, and the worker doesn't have to be responsible for doing any more than necessary. So you have numerous workers out there doing very specialized movements in a small amount of space so that you are controlling every part of the process, much like the rotors or the gears in a machine. These ideas stemming from Frederick Taylor and scientific management. Again, you have links available to you in the module that will give a nice visual summary of the work of Frederick Taylor. But Frederick Taylor and a lot of the other workers along this time period were searching for the one best way. This idea that if you can eliminate the inefficiencies in getting work done, that you can find the one best way for getting your particular job accomplished, for getting your particular automobile produced, for instance. There were a lot of time and motion studies that were conducted in this time period, which is the process of getting a group of workers, particularly skilled in a particular area, making a careful study of how they get their work accomplished. So in the imagery here, they may have been sort of putting something together, watching the movements, noting how long each particular movement takes, timing it, and making the work more efficient by eliminating any inefficient steps. So any slow movements, useless movements, anything that might have contributed to fatigue, etc. All of that was examining sort of things very carefully, earlier work of industrial engineering, where you are timing out and breaking out all of the steps that are needed to get work done into minute processes that could then be tailored to fit, no pun intended, to fit the best way to get a job done. So the emphasis here is on efficiency, predictability, and control. Ultimately, it's on dehumanizing work. And there are certain pros and cons to that, as we will explore over the course of time, and I ask you to even consider in the first discussion questions, because there are certain places where you benefit as a consumer from efficiency, but you may not necessarily benefit as a worker in those same environments. So scientific management, we may see time and motion studies still prevail, particularly in industrial settings, but we'll also see it in a variety of office settings as people are constantly trying to look at productivity. Are there systems that can be put into place? Now it may be looking for more efficient software that can help to cut out particular steps. It may be looking for modernizing equipment in a particular location, but sometimes it comes down to just sort of managing how a particular worker may manage their day. So the illustration that is on this particular slide shows how a person may separate all the actions that they do in a particular workday, from getting ready for work to meetings, emails, time returning calls, paperwork, etc., and documenting within every particular hour how long they are taking in every hour, half hour of their day, how long they're taking doing any of these tasks. And then from there you might look at, there's too much time being spent on commute or travel or catching up. If people are being truthful, all of these things that may be examined. If there's too much time being taken up on reports and paperwork, that may be where people will insert different software modifications. If there's too much time being taken in travel, then you may see relocation or other kinds of ideas being put together to make for more efficient use of time and increased productivity. So the ideas around efficiency that stemmed with time and motion studies in the 1920s and 30s, we still see prevailing today. Now, along with Taylor, there was another prominent set of ideas started from Max Weber, and he was a sociologist that thought about and theorized about the ideal bureaucracy. So again, the emphasis is on ideal. It's not on what we actually find, but the theory is that an ideal bureaucracy would have 6 certain elements that would enable and increase efficiency. The first of those elements is a fixed division of labor, also known as specialization. So this is where everyone does one specific task or role. So if you think about your fast food restaurants, perhaps you have someone that's manning the fries, someone that's in charge of assembling the burgers, another person who is putting the order, assembling the order into a bag, someone who's manning the cash register. Everyone has a particular job that they're responsible for, and very little spreading out to do multiple roles. Fixed or more specialization from a Weber point of view makes for more efficiency because everyone learns their particular task very well, and generalists are not needed, and they're even easier to replace should you have turnover or issues with who to employ. You can focus on a very specialized set of tasks and interject in different workers as needed. So there's certain efficiencies that come along with specialization. Number 2, hierarchy of authority. So the set of ideas that every person is supervised by someone in a higher position until it gets to the very top. So why do we want this layer or these layers of authority? Because it keeps things structured, keeps the span of control minimal. By that, layers helps you to bring more efficient control instead of having one boss that has to oversee all of the individuals in an organization. You add in layers of managers or directors or supervisors so that the supervisors are increasingly managing a smaller number of people so that you create a more vertical organization from the top to the bottom, but you have a more narrow span of control for each manager, and you get your authority. Oversight is in place without any particular manager being overstretched. So hierarchy of authority becomes an important element in an ideal bureaucracy. Number 3, explicit performance or written rules are important. So there are rules for everything, and all rules must be formalized. Thus, you see handbooks and official policies. People aren't allowed to make up things as they go, and this helps to minimize chaos and inconsistencies. And it brings on more standardization. So in every modern day organization, there will be an employee handbook or a set of rules and processes and procedures. Depending on the age or the culture or the type of the organization, these can be more or less extensive, but there are a lot of reasons, particularly with the rise of us becoming a much more litigious society where people will and workers will need to be clearly There need to be clearly defined rules related to human resources and employee conduct, etc., so that you can have a standard set of expectations out there, explicit rules. So again, according to Weber, explicit performance and written rules are part of what an ideal bureaucracy has. 4, you want to separate personal and official property and rights. A better way to think about this is impersonality. So you don't want individuality. You want to have clear set of rules as in the previous statement, and everyone's expected to follow those rules, and no one can do whatever you want. It can be down to even why you have uniforms so that there isn't a need to worry about too much individuality being expressed in clothing. There may be rules as to how to greet a customer, how to conduct a customer service call. Again, you don't want, in an ideal bureaucracy, you want little individuality. You want a separate rights within the workplace that are separate from what you may do on your own or personally. So again, the idea here is that it allows for smoother employee interactions and consistencies in processes and outcomes. 5 is the idea of qualification-based employment. So personnel are selected for technical qualifications. You get the job based on what you can do and not based on who you know or tenure or legacy. So again, if you think about how we were moving out of in the earlier part of the 20th century, late 19th century, as things were moving outside of these cottage industries, People may have been in certain roles because they had inherited them. It was a family business. They weren't necessarily in those roles because of expertise or skill, and that can sometimes create a lot of inefficiencies, of course. In a Weber sense of an ideal bureaucracy, you would have people in jobs based on their qualifications. People get promoted based on their experience and their skill. Again, it's the ideal bureaucracy, not what we know actually happens. But we'll talk more about what actually happens when we think about metaphors related to culture and politics. But in this more structured machine view of the world, technical qualifications are all that matters. And lastly, the separation of work and ownership. Employment is the primary occupation. Employees don't own the equipment. They don't own the organization. They don't have any say in the actual profits of the organization or any of the tools or equipment that is needed to get any of the work done. They are merely employees. And so therefore, you dictate to them what your expectations are. You expect those things of them, and there isn't any blurred lines between ownership and work. So for Weber, these 6 concepts are what makes an organization run more efficiently. It brings in much more rationality and control. So these ideas of rationality is that you're taking out the irrational or more human aspects of society, and you're making the job and the task as logical and rational as possible, increasing elements of control and decreasing any problems that can lead to inefficiency. Structural assumptions in the machine way of thinking then are composed of these 6 ideas. So organizations exist to achieve established goals and objectives. Any organization, from nonprofit to for-profit to teams, higher learning, universities, hospitals, what have you, any organization has some established goals and objectives, given that there's certain structure that is needed to achieve those goals and objectives. Second, specialization and division of labor increases efficiency and performance. So again, this is a core assumption in the machine way of thinking. Specialization is key. Dividing up, differentiation becomes important so that you know who is doing what, where different tasks are being performed, and all of the elements of what is needed from inputs to outputs have been broken down and divided up. Third, with that, then you need the appropriate forms of coordination and control. So this is the other side. From differentiation, you need to also understand how you're going to integration. So how are you going to coordinate and control and oversee the different divisions and specialized areas so that everything can come back together, be monitored efficiently to achieve the first objectives and goals that every organization has. Fourth, you have the idea that organizations work best when rationality prevails and not personal agendas. So all elements of taking out individuality and any aspect of personal agendas is the goal or the aim in this machine way of thinking in this framework. 5, a structure must fit with its circumstances. So a structure must align with what is expected of the organization and the environment, the technology, and when we get into moving away from the machine to the organism, we'll talk a lot more about fit. But in environment, the technology, the workforce, the goals of any organization, a structure must be aligned with it. So if you are producing highly technical equipment, you need a workforce that matches the kind of knowledge base that's needed to produce it. You need a certain investment in certain structures to produce those particular items. There's different structures that are needed for organizations that produce goods versus organizations that are providing a service. There's different structures that are needed if you can provide your outputs internationally or multinational locations as opposed to if you are operating in a localized environment. So all of these are just different ways that different circumstances exist that will affect what an organization should be structured as. And lastly, problems arise from structural deficiencies. So anytime that you have something not working right in terms of specialization, coordination, and control, anytime there's more personal agendas or individuality, wasted movements, wasted time, any of these are thought of as deficiencies that can be fixed, quote unquote, through restructuring. So again, the emphasis is how do we then reposition, redo our division of labor? How do we increase control or change how we're coordinating and the elements of control? How do we bring more rationality into a situation if we're finding any problems or deficiencies? So this way of thinking tends to focus on these set of ideas above all else. And again, like we talked about in the first module, first two modules, that this is a particular framework that has emphasized a certain number of things that then lead to a certain way of thinking, making decisions, etc. So for your discussions, we'll just have two discussions for this module and no written assignment, but two rather extensive discussions that ask you to think about, one, the earlier set of these ideas, and then two, how these ideas are proliferating in different contexts and in the more modern age. So for discussion topic 3.1, you'll consider images of work in the earlier 20th century. You'll look at a clip from Modern Times, a movie with Charlie Chaplin, that has a lot to say about the industrial age. It was actually done in the 1930s by Charlie Chaplin to be a critique on the industrial age at that time. You only need to look at the first 18 minutes of this movie, but you're welcome to watch the entire film. It is a film without a lot of voices or narration. It's very visual. With that, it gives you an excellent opportunity. I ask you or employ you to pay attention to all of the imagery that you see in there and ask yourself sort of why this would be necessary. Yes, it's taken to an extreme, but what are the implications? So there's a set of questions that I look forward to you all discussing and debating as related to the images that you see in that particular clip. For the second discussion topic, you'll think about the McDonaldization movement. So McDonaldization is a concept that George Ritzer wrote about first in the early 80s, and a concept where he's saying there's certain principles of McDonaldization, control, predictability, calculability, and efficiency that stems from, if you think about the structure of McDonald's, but has prevailed outside of McDonald's into how a lot of different services or good industries have developed. So McDonaldization is a concept that we see present in different forms of organizations today. And now I'll ask you to consider, any experience you may have had with a more McDonaldized organization, whether you've worked in one or just been a frequent customer of one, or other industries and organizations that are incorporating McDonald's-like methods. And we'll even have a link, or you should see a link to some other examples, and even a modern TED Talk that talks about some global implications where people have tried to extend the McDonald's concept to meet the goals and objectives and more for societal needs and societal sake. So I'm looking forward to your discussions as we kick off the first of the metaphors that we are discussing over this